All right, hello everyone. Let me get my slideshow up here. There we go. Okay, all right. Thanks everyone for joining us today. This is so exciting. My name is Katie Buesch, and I'm the executive director and curator at the Clark Historical Museum. And I'm also the Eureka Chinatown Project walking tour lead. Um, and before we get started here, I just wanted to give a couple of acknowledgements for some people whose work is going to be showing up in today's presentation. Chisato Hughes, her videography is featured in this presentation, and she was also the writer of our land acknowledgement. So thank you to her. And then also thanks to Josh Buck, who's another local historian, who provided some of the colorized imagery that I'll be sharing with you all today. It's very exciting. This is the first time we've shown the colorized pictures to the public. So let's get to it. So our land acknowledgement that we start all of our Chinatown project events with is this. So Eureka's Chinatown occupies unceded Wiyot territory. Eureka's Wiyot name is Jarujiji, which means where you sit and rest, which is opposed to the settler notion of Eureka, I have found it. May we work to make this place one where we can all sit and rest safely while paying respect to those whose land we're on. And with any sort of land acknowledgement, it's really important to also include a call to action. So today's call to action is share something from this presentation with a friend, colleague, or family member. And the presentation, of course, will be made available through YouTube, I think, in a couple days. So that's also an easy way to share something you've learned, is to share this with someone you know. So I first became interested in the story of Eureka's Chinatown back in 2019, and this pot actually was donated to the museum, and the donor had mentioned that it had a connection to Chinatown. So this is his comments here. My great grandmother Henrietta Ladd Chapman lived at 8th and N in Eureka, and when she had heard about the Chinese expulsion, she walked over to Chinatown and pulled out this jug, and it's been in their family ever since. I'd heard about the expulsion before, but really only in passing. People mentioned that there used to be a Chinatown, but now there wasn't, and that someone had been shot and that had something to do with it. But I began wondering what kind of situation would lead a community of people to forcefully remove a part of their population. There had to be some kind of explanation. It couldn't have just been someone was shot. There had to be some larger story to it that I just didn't know. So I began researching and eventually wrote an article for the Humboldt Historian about the event and created an exhibit called Immigration Expulsion Homecoming, which opened up in February of 2020. Just about a year later, of course, into the pandemic, on March 19th, Brianne Merja, who I think is here today, made plans for a group of interested people to meet on Zoom on April 3rd, which, is a year ago tomorrow, to discuss the possibility of putting some sort of memorial, likely a plaque, in or around Chinatown. Since then, the group has grown to almost 40 people, and we've brought over 200 people virtually and in person to the site of Chinatown through tours. We've shared the Chinatown story with others through virtual presentations like this one, and we've added multiple landmarks to the area to promote visibility of Eureka's Chinatown. And all of this has happened within the course of just under a year, just about a year, which is pretty incredible for any sort of community endeavor. So there's that. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about Eureka's Chinatown. If you want a more in-depth story about it, we've done a couple of other presentations that can be found online. But here's just kind of the basic story. So we'll talk about that, and then we'll also talk about what's been happening over the last year by the Chinatown Project. So first of all, whoops, there we go. Okay, actually, I hope this side part isn't cut off. Can you guys see the words over here?
A little cut off.
Okay. I don't know why it's doing that.
Do you have the sorry, my brain just completely shut down. The screen with everyone's photo on it as a sidebar. Open?
No, for some reason it's my taskbar that's showing up.
Okay.
Okay, well, we'll go with it. It'll be okay. So Chinese immigrants to Eureka generally came from Guangdong province, which is on the southern part of China. They left behind a wide variety of civil unrest and natural disasters to come to places like California, specifically California to work in the gold fields, but also just the West in general for building railroads. There was rampant recruiting of Chinese workers specifically to go work on building railroads like the Transcontinental Railroad. But when projects like that finished and when things like the foreign miners tax were imposed and things like that, it drove Chinese residents from things like the gold fields into towns like Eureka. Eventually they got into working in a variety of other trades: farming, laundry, fishing. They worked on mule trains, they built roads and other buildings, servant work, but they also owned their own businesses. This colorized image is one example of someone who's referred to as a truck farmer. So they would operate these things called truck farms, which are out on the outskirts of town. And they provided a large amount of their fruits and vegetables and livestock to the city of Eureka, which is pretty cool. And also down in the corner here is a little cut off, sorry about that, is an ad in the local paper for a Chinese business, Kang Hop Co., which was on 4th and F Streets. So the area that we refer to as Chinatown is the area confined within E and F and 4th and 5th. But something that's really important to note is that not all Chinese residents were confined to this block. There were, 200 or 300 people. They didn't all live right here. They lived in other areas as well. And here's a map to kind of show that. We more recently know that there were laundries operated at the foot of F Street that were owned by Chinese residents. So it's very likely that residents also possibly lived in that area, but also people who were working as servants and things like that also lived in the homes of the people they worked for sometimes. So in this picture, Chinatown is outlined in the red square. And then there's kind of these arrows that point to other areas. And then the truck gardens were on the outskirts of town, which at the time, town kind of ended around 8th Street. So these other areas like Hillsdale and Pines Pasture, those were out in the woods or out, on the edges of town. You can also look at records from the 1880 census that shows that Chinese residents lived with white families outside of Chinatown. So that I kind of mentioned that. So the core of Chinatown, which is, if we were to be looking at the map at the same time, is off to the right of this image. You can see there's kind of some small buildings all kind of lined up. That is Chinatown. That is the block that we refer to as Chinatown. It was made up of buildings made from scrap lumber. The land was owned by a guy named C.S. Ricks, who was a wealthy landowner and business owner. He owned the Palace Stables, which is kind of in the background here off to the left side. Chinatown had businesses and homes, but also had brothels and opium dens, and a similar compilation of buildings, except instead of opium dens, there were bars. A similar composition existed on nearby 2 Street, which is now known as Old Town. You'll notice in this image a couple of important things, that this part of Eureka kind of sloped downward towards where the photographer was taking this picture from. You'll also notice the raised sidewalk on the right side of the image. The business composition of Chinatown and the lay of the land, the physical geography of the land, plays an important role in how Chinatown was seen by the non-Chinese public and how had an impact on what happened in 1885. Chinatown is located on what we think of as a slough. It's a semi-swampy-like area. Usually the slough would drain out, but due to some recent road improvements, including raising the level of the road, the water that would usually drain out became stuck in Chinatown, which had a natural dip in it. At the time, of course, there wasn't indoor plumbing, so any sort of refuse water from dishes or cleaning or anything like that would get stuck in this indent in Chinatown, in this natural indent, and it couldn't drain out. So we see things like this newspaper article that describes Chinatown as a foul area with all of this kind of stagnant water. Combining this with prejudices around language barriers, people in Chinatown were speaking generally the same dialect of Chinese that the English-speaking residents outside didn't understand. There was also prejudice around Chinese opium use, whereas white residents were also using opium, but it was in a different form. It was called laudanum, and used for treating pretty much anything. There was also fears around gang warfare that was leading to increasing violence in the area in the months leading up to February 1886. There was also a lack of intercultural understanding and fear. So with all of these things happening at the same time, along with legislative action, the physical site of Chinatown became a sore spot in relationships between Chinese and non-Chinese residents. Now, on February 6th, around 6:30 p.m., to set the scene where it's about an hour after sunset, it's probably kind of damp. It might be raining. It's the wet season in Humboldt County. Shots ring out in Chinatown, kind of nearby Chinatown. And that wasn't itself unusual. There was gunfights that had been happening in the weeks leading up to February 6th. But what was unusual was that a white man was accidentally shot. This is David Kendall, who was a local councilman. He was accidentally shot in this gunfight. He happened to be walking by and there was a stray bullet. There was also a young boy who was accidentally shot in the foot. The boy survived, but Kendall didn't. And within about 30 minutes of the shots being fired, there were a couple hundred people that had met up at Centennial Hall, which is kind of above Chinatown in this map here. At least one person that we know of, Reverend Huntington, documented in his memoir that he stood up against the agitating mob. He was urging moderation and urging people to not blame the entire Chinese population for the accidental shooting of Councilman Kendall. And then people started proposing ideas on what to do about the Chinese population because they were done with this increasing violence and needed a reason to remove the Chinese population. So people came up with different options. Some people mentioned putting all the Chinese residents in Chinatown and burning all the buildings down, running people into the woods. But eventually a committee of 15 was formed to come up with some sort of sensible option and hopefully to avoid violence. But that sensible option ended up being forced expulsion of all the Chinese residents. So all the residents needed to be at the docks within 24 hours to set sail for San Francisco. Packing commenced immediately, but due to low water levels in the bay, the ships had to wait another day before leaving. Chinese residents arrived in San Francisco on a Sunday. The docks were not being manned by officials, and telegraph lines that would have sent the word about the expulsion down to San Francisco were down due to some inclement weather. So the Chinese residents got off of the ships in San Francisco and disappeared into town. Usually when you do hear the story told, that's kind of where it ends. Eureka expelled its Chinese population. There were no more Chinese people. La-di-da for the next decades, many decades, until Ben Chin comes back. So the Chinese expulsion is, frequently framed as a event of how a community came together to forcefully remove people. But it's also a story of a community of people, the Chinese residents, as a group and as individuals who resisted against unlawful and unjust action, both in 1885 and nowadays as well. So the Eureka Chinatown project draws much of its inspiration from these stories of resistance. One of those famous stories, of course, is Charlie Moon. He's probably the most famous example of a Chinese person who stayed behind after the expulsion, but he wasn't the only one, just the most famous one. And there's people within the Chinatown project that are trying to uncover more of these Chinese residents who stayed behind. But anyway, so Charlie worked for Tom Bear, who was a rancher on Redwood Creek. And Charlie was only about in his 20s when the Chinese expulsion happened. And the story goes is that a group of men had come up from Eureka to Redwood Creek to take Charlie away a few days after the expulsion. And the story goes is that Tom Bear picks up a shotgun and told the men that he'd have to get through them first to get Charlie. And the men didn't really want to do that. So they turned around and went back to Eureka. And Charlie lived on the ranch for the remainder of his life. He worked for Tom Bear for something like 60 or 70 years. He married a local native lady and they had many, many kids. And this picture here is actually a small segment of the Moon family. We hosted a tour specifically for the Moon family very early on in the project. I think it was probably May or June, I think, when we first started doing these walking tours of last year. And this was the number of Moon family members we could get a hold of in like a week or two long span. And there's actually more. I think there's about 40 people that showed up in total. And so to recognize Charlie's resistance and his life in Humboldt County, the road running through the Chinatown block has been renamed Charlie Moon Way, officially by the city, I think a couple months ago, but we're going to be doing a formal recognition of the renaming in May, and I'll talk about that at the end of the presentation. But the story of Charlie Moon and his descendants is actually also being made into a documentary by Chisato Hughes, who I mentioned a little earlier. The documentary is called Many Moons, and I have a link for the trailer for the film, which is in production right now, and we can take a look at that real quick. So let's get that all set up here. Oh man. Internet, okay. Here we go.
So what did I think of Humboldt County? When we were going to move here, my mother, who lived in the Bay Area, said, "You be careful up there. Things happen to Chinese people." What I want to say about the Chinese in Humboldt County is that after the expulsions, there were Chinese who didn't leave. We don't really know who they are, except for Charlie Moon. I don't know how. I'm never going to find this out, but I would really like to know what other Chinese there were that nobody's talking about.
What I've found about Chinese expulsion largely is we only tell the part of it that we want to tell.
Because of the history, we grew up with the culture of don't tell. I'm pretty determined, so I'll find out more. I may not find out everything, but I'll find out more.
Well, when I grew up, we heard of what they did to the Chinese, and a lot of people used to poke fun at us and we'll run you out of town, you know, if you don't behave, you know, whatever. When they run out of the Chinese out of Humboldt County, they probably, if you were Chinese, you wouldn't be talking Chinese. Yeah, hey, they left this one behind, you know.
Over the years, people come up to ask us about the story about him, you know. And I guess that ain't really his picture. That's not him. That's just a Chinese man. But they used it and they seen it in the newspaper. I don't know who that man is.
Oops. Okay, here we go. All right. So hopefully that came through okay. If not, I'll be sure everyone gets the link afterwards for it. Here's that map we looked at earlier with the alley noted on it as well, in case you were wondering where it was at. So another story of resistance is that a year after the expulsion, there were 55 former Chinese residents of Eureka who filed a lawsuit against the city because of the forced removal that happened. The case was the first formal lawsuit for reparations filed by the Chinese, and was using a line in the city's charter that made the city liable for mob actions. And that was a major component of the case that they had against the city. And the case was that the city was responsible for protecting the rights of all residents, Chinese, American, citizen or not. And due to the negligence on the part of the city, the Chinese were removed, violating their rights and making them eligible for reparations for the material losses they experienced, along with the emotional harm they experienced. The city, for reasons that I've been trying to figure out, was able to remove all the Chinese claims of lost property from the case, thereby gutting it and making it pretty much ineffective. The case was closed a few years later, but not a lot of research has really gone into why the case ended how it did. Local newspapers give a bunch of different reasons, but they don't really all add up. So this is something that I'm personally doing research on, and I hope to present my findings in the future, maybe as an article for the historian or maybe for a presentation on its own. So as I've said, resistance, resilience, and revival are key values of the Eureka Chinatown project. And drawing on these stories, the project has completed some major additions to the Chinatown block, including this mural, which is titled Foul. It was painted during the 2021 Eureka Street Art Festival, which, if we're looking at the timeline of the Chinatown project, which started kind of in April, this mural went up in August of 2021, which is just incredible speed to happen from this is an idea to this is up on a wall now. And it looks like we'll have a little bit of time here so I can share another video that Chisa made about the mural. So let me flip over to that real quick. And this is a video that features the artist David Young Kim, who was the painter for the mural and was the lead designer for it. So let's get that.
Hi, I'm Dave. My typical work consists of digging into family stories and researching how that relates to my life, my family life, and also how it connects to our present situation wherever we are. So when I was notified of this opportunity, it was right up my alley. I was excited. After the railroads and the gold rush sort of died out, the Chinese settled into towns up here, so around 1860. For about 25 years, they created a community. 1885, there was an incident that happened where they were all kicked out. Within 3 days, they were just pick up and leave. Right here on this block, there was a grade in this town, and all the sewage ran down into this area, and there's a creek, and all that stuff should normally drain into the creek. But the city planners built curbs so that the water pooled instead. Where the water pooled was where the tenements were, where the Chinese community was. So that became like a character, the dirty Chinese, the foul Chinese, the unclean. There was a particular line that stood out to me. It was written like in the 1880s. The Chinese were fond of ducks and they allowed them to swim in the pools by their homes. So it's kind of this derogatory association with ducks. And so immediately I was like, I gotta bring back that duck. So I was doing research and I was like, the Mandarin Duck, it's native to China. It's very beautiful, colorful. It means young love, happiness, they mate for life, children. Symbolically that works well because there are 200 men, Chinese men and like 20 women. So, you know, they're longing from home, they can't mate for life, they can't have children. They're kind of making these sacrifices to be here. So I'm like symbolically returning that to the Chinese. And then 1955, the first Chinese person comes back, Mr. Ben Chin. That's pretty recent, and that's a long time after.
I was just really touched that they wanted to honor my dad because he passed a couple of years ago, and He was really instrumental. I don't think he realized it at the time because he came here mainly to open up a business. He just basically paved the way for a lot of Asians to come to Humboldt and not be fearful.
The Chinese characters are hometown. So sort of alluding back to China, but also this is hometown. For 25 years, this is home, and then you're asked to leave in 3 days. I like to pull from traditional art, and although I'm Korean American, there's a heavy Chinese influence in Korean art, so it works for both cultures. The sun and the moon, so the circles are actually, the red circle's the sun and the white circle's the moon. In traditional works, it depicts passage of time or for eternity. You pair it with auspicious symbols and then you put the passage of time on top of that, and it's like, I bless you for eternity, or I hope you have a long life. And they're decorative on the wall for that purpose, like a good omen or good luck. So in the same way, for Eureka and everyone here, it's sort of a blessing for you guys, right?
So here's that map again and shows where the mural's at. It's hard to miss though, a giant duck. It's a great mural. I'm so happy that ended up working out. So also on the Chinatown block, and actually just part of the block a little bit away from Chinatown, there's going to be these 2 kiosk signs. They're hosted by the city of Eureka. We were able to get these signs created and they will soon be installed on these kiosks. While the city was in the process of redoing them, we were able to get a hold of some people and sneak in some information on Eureka's Chinatown and the Chinese expulsion. So thank you to the city and Eddie Alexander for helping us get these projects on the ground and visible to visitors and the local public. There's where those 2 kiosks are going to be. The one that's not really on the Chinatown block is just out front of, I think it's a place called Zen. And then the one that is on the Chinatown block is just outside of Ellis Art. So we're hoping those will be up by this summer. Also in the works is an audio tour and a video tour that's being produced by Ann Howard, who's an intern for the Clark, for the Chinatown Project, and for Cal Poly Humboldt's special collections. A project that she's also working on that I'm super excited about is she's taking scans of the Chinese pamphlet files and things related to Eureka's Chinatown and Eureka's Chinese population, and she's scanning them to make them available online, which is very exciting. As many of them are very old, and this will be a great way to share them not only locally, but also with people from out of the area who are interested in studying what happened in Eureka. And another project that's slated for completion around May is the Chinatown Monument. So this monument represents the increase, demolition, and return of the Chinese population locally through these stones. So you'll notice the stones kind of wind around, going from kind of the street corner towards this tree, back towards the street corner, and then off to the left here. And I haven't been super involved in this project, so I'm basing this off of notes I received from people. But the stones represent the growing population of Eureka's Chinese residents. And then there's the 3 short ones that represent the expulsion years, and then the return of the Chinese population over time as the stones get bigger, moving towards the left. The monument was designed by John King with landscaping work by Jessica Hall. And this is on the corner of 4th and E. It's also going to include Chinese calligraphy characters by Pearl Wang Liang Huang that is kind of evoking this story of the Chinese in Eureka. There's also going to be a poem written by Daryl Chin, who's actually here today, written by Daryl Chin that's going to be showing up on the curb kind of around this planter box. And there's also going to be a ginkgo tree present as well. So if you want to see that, that's going to be right there on the corner of 4th and E. And the hope is that that's going to be up by the beginning of May, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And the project all began with this idea of putting a plaque at the site of Chinatown, and that has not gone away. That is still here. So the plaque that will be going with this monument is going to have this text on it. So this monument is located in the area that was once historic Chinatown. It commemorates the rise of the Chinese community in Humboldt County and its purge and the expulsion of 1885. The few Chinese who remained were welcomed by local indigenous groups. Today, we celebrate the presence of our thriving and diverse Asian American community. And this project with the monument and the plaque, along with all the other projects, took countless hours of writing, editing, discussion, Zoom meetings, emails, so many emails, and really concerted effort on behalf of a number of different committees that were set up specifically to work on these projects. So big shout out to everyone who has invested an incredible amount of time in making these projects move from a dream to a reality. And so for the Eureka Chinatown project, for me, it's been a truly amazing project to be part of. When I first started out researching this topic, it was kind of more of a scholarly endeavor. It was a mystery to figure out about a particular set of events at a particular time. But as the project really began picking up steam, it became, whoops, sorry. It became, Parker, stop. It became it became really clear that this project has real impacts on the people here locally and the communities here locally. Working on this project has connected me with a team of really deeply invested people who are working on strengthening ties and supporting everyone in this community through a mode of historical understanding. Through the addition of visible features in the Chinatown block and walking tours, taking people to where it all happened back in 1885, the Eureka Chinatown project is making this buried story known again outside of archives and books, bringing a community of people together in conversation with an exploration of local and regional history. It's made me realize that this is why the study and sharing of history is important. For the stories we uncover from the past to be used to inspire resilience in the present. The Eureka Chinatown project is forming meaningful connections and forging a stronger community in the process as we learn to reckon with the dark past in pursuit of hope for a better future for everyone in our local community. So with that, I hope the folks listening in today or tuning into the recording afterwards might be inspired to get involved with this project. And there's many, many, many ways to do that. One big thing that is really easy to do is to come out to our events. So on Saturday, May 7th, we're going to be having the Year of the Tiger celebration. It's going to be a two-part event. So from 3 to 4 p.m., we're going to have a ribbon cutting ceremony for the official dedication of Charlie Moon Way. That'll be a good chance also to come out and see the mural, hopefully see the kiosk signs and also the monument. And that's going to be in the parking lot area of Coast Central Credit Union on East Street between 4th and 5th. And then the second part from 5 to 9, there's going to be a street festival, which this is also during Arts Alive. That's going to be in front of the Clark Museum with performances by Humboldt Taiko, Lao dancers, and a number of other groups and musicians from 5 to 9. We're also going to be doing walking tours throughout the summer, and those are $10 to $20 per person, sliding scale for tickets. And those can be purchased from the Clark Museum website, which is on here, and I'll be sure you guys get the link afterwards. And you can also go there to see all of the dates lined up for the coming tour season. If you want to keep in touch with us, and we really hope that you do, it would be really great. You can follow us on Facebook if you're in that, or if you want to join our email list, that's through hoppyhumboldt.org/Eureka Chinatown project. You can join on there, and we'll be sure to have these links, sent out to you all. So with that, thank you for tuning in. I'm going to end my little screen share thing here. Make sure everyone writes down the details of our events so you hopefully come out. Yeah, does anyone have any questions? I think the chat box looked like it had some things light up. So let's see.
It looks, I think somebody was wondering the first video of the many moons. Who was the last man that was speaking that had the photograph that wasn't the man that he thought it was supposed to be? You know who that was?
So I don't know off the top of my head. I think it's one of the Moon family members. But I'm actually not sure. That's a good question.
We may just have to wait to see many moons to solve
Yeah.
that mystery. And do you know when that's coming out? When it should be available?
I'm not sure, but I've been talking with Chisato about doing a showing at the museum. So, so if you're following us through Facebook or through the email list for the museum or for the Chinatown project, you should get a notice for that. Let me.
Let's see. Oh, also it is Steve's birthday today, apparently. So I'm gonna unmute everybody and we'll sing happy birthday to you. Does that sound good? I won't do that. I'm not gonna do that.
And then I did see there was a question that said what years, and I'm not sure exactly what you meant by that. If you want to, Sherman, if you want to type in some clarification on that. Lawsuit. Oh, what years was the lawsuit filed? So it was filed in 1886 and it was officially thrown out in 1889.
And I do have a question from a patron I was speaking to earlier today about the walking tours. If there would ever be a way to make them virtual, like some sort of virtual tour that somebody who is maybe doesn't have the mobility issues, the mobility to do the tour.
Yeah, that's in the works right now. One of our interns is doing that with us and Special Collections in the Chinatown project. She was able to borrow a 360 camera. So she did the walking tour and is working on all the editing and everything like that. But we're hoping by the end of the semester, which is like mid-May, it should be just about done.
Fantastic. All right. Well, it looks like there aren't any other questions. So I guess we'll go ahead and let everybody go. Thank you. Oh, there's a question.
I see one more question. Before the Chinese moved in, was that block area just a swamp marsh bog with no buildings? That's a good question. I mean, the city was expanding continually as people came up here for logging and for mining and all of that stuff. So really the only information I've seen of what that area was before the Chinese lived there was a news article that someone published, and I'm trying to remember what year it was published in, but it made a reappearance at Redheaded Black Belt a couple months ago, which is kind of funny. But anyway, there was a story about Ulysses S. Grant riding around in the area when he was stationed at Fort Humboldt, walking across a log and falling in a slough. And then they mentioned it specifically at that same kind of area, which is how we were able to determine that it was a slough. Yeah, so yeah, before there were buildings there, I think it was undeveloped land, but I'm not really sure. And then Daryl mentions in here too. So Daryl's a member of the Chinatown project also. Eureka Chinatown wasn't burned because it was owned by someone else who convinced the mob he didn't want his property destroyed, which is true. And especially at this time, if there was a fire that broke out, you know, a lot of the buildings are wooden, so it would be really easy for the fire to spread elsewhere. So that was a concern, especially because Rick's owned property that was also nearby. He didn't want the fire to spread to other properties. But within a couple of years, Eureka's Chinatown was disassembled and new buildings were built there. And we see articles coming out saying that people are going into Chinatown and purchasing stoves. I'm not sure who they're purchasing them from. I'm guessing Rick's, but purchasing stoves for like 25 cents, you know, just stuff that was left behind. But yeah. And yeah, Steve says many natural drainage courses were altered as the city grew. Yeah. And so we now know who the man at the end of the trailer, that was Richard Moon. So anyway, if you have any last questions, quick, throw them in. Otherwise, I think we're
last
done.
call for questions. All right, well, I guess on that note, we'll go ahead and let everybody go. Thank you so much. That was so interesting. Everybody go on May 7th, or I think it was May 7th for the the ribbon cutting, and it sounds like it's going to be a great event. So thank you so much. Thank you everybody for joining us. If you are here, that means you're on my email list. You'll get the notification for next month's lecture. And yeah, if you have any questions or any other comments, just feel free to email me. You've got my email, or contact Katie or the Chinatown Project. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.